So please welcome the Reverend Mike Angell.
I kind of feel like I should have scarves attached to that, like Steven from Aerosmith. So like Jason said, I'm really here. It's funny to have come into this job because for a long time they called people who did what I do program officers. And the idea was that we would write curriculum or create these great programs that then we could package and send out to people to run. And I just don't think the church works like that. I don't know if it ever really worked like that. But what I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about today were some ideas, some principles that I think are shaping ministry today. And especially shaping ministry with young adults on and off college campuses. And so the first principle that I'm going to see if my iPhone actually does what it's supposed to do. The first principle is this, leadership. And this is a quote from the Industrial Areas Foundation Community Organizing Training. If I could have taken the whole weekend, I would have just invited the Industrial Areas Foundation to come here and invite you all to go to it. So if you haven't had a chance yet to plug in with community organizers and with a body that does community organizing training, I really recommend it. But they have two ideas about leaders. And I think they're sort of revolutionary for the church. And the two ideas are this. A leader has followers. A leader has followers. I worked in the church for a really long time with a lot of people that were leaders. Who came and sat on committees and made decisions, but I'm not sure how many of them have followers. I mean, like, just by definition, you have to have followers to be a leader, or you're a leader of one, you know? You're party of one. So a leader has followers. It's sort of revolutionary, but the idea that somebody who's leading in the church needs to have a following, needs to have people that look to them, that pay attention to them. One of the things that we used to do, I was the assistant rector at St. John's here in Washington, D.C. in Lafayette Square, and when I was picking leaders for my young adult group, what we were paying attention to more than anything else was who showed up to things we were doing with friends. Who brought people to church, to Theology on Tap, to a wine tasting? Who brought people in? Who had followers? The other piece is, and this is setting the bar really high, but a leader can put 20 people in a room. Here's my theory. And I don't know if biblical scholarship would support me or not. We could get Becky Zartman to ask Kathy Grebe about this, but Kathy Grebe's a New Testament professor at Virginia Seminary. But if you look at the Gospels, you often see Jesus in front of thousands, or hundreds, or how many people is he feeding? There's different numbers, but it's thousands. But if you look at the Gospels, you also see that Jesus spends most of his time in conversations with just a few people. That Jesus sort of has a constellation of folks around him. And that Jesus spends his time talking with, preaching to, teaching, working on the rough edges of about 12 people. Where those thousands come from? Jesus has a preaching reputation, sure. But when you focus on developing leaders, you're able to have a much bigger impact. When you focus on developing leaders, you can back off from worrying so much about getting a program exactly right. So one piece is to talk about leadership development. And I think that some of the ministries that are really doing incredible stuff and have a much bigger footprint than you would expect, because there's a focus on leadership development. And they're taking people who have a following and bringing them to the point where they might be able to put 20 people in a room to do something with the church. Next piece, and you'll see this here in the next slide. We're going to show a video. And if you can't see the video well, scoot up and take a look at the screen. That's Southside Abbey. Southside Abbey's in Chattanooga, and Bob Leopold is the priest in the Abbey. But what did you see? Whose voices did you hear throughout that video? You can actually respond. Who did you see? Young people?
A lot of lay leaders.
A lot of lay leaders. How was their language? You know, what did they say? Did they sound like the sort of uninitiated? What I love about that video is that you can tell that these folks have talked about what they're doing, why they're doing. That there's a real desire to tell the story that they've spent a lot of time thinking about together. Basically, you can tell from that video that Bob Leopold has pulled together a leadership team and has spent time with them one-on-one and in small groups developing what this is. And they have a shared language and a shared philosophy, and they've all bought into and are selling this idea of what church is. And that's an image of a dinner church as well. So there's a piece about this that is all about leadership development. And one of the things, I just talked to Bob Leopold this last week on the phone, and he's sort of in this lament mode right now because so many of his leaders have gone off to seminary or have gone off to the Episcopal Service Corps. And part of my understanding of initiatives like this is that we need more young leaders in the church. And programs like what Bob is doing that focus on developing young leaders, they build community, they build church, but they also send young leaders out. And so that's a big component of it. Another piece of this video, I'm just gonna run up here and run my slides like this. Have me step there. Community partnerships. At one point, Bob says, one of our principles is community partnerships. They meet in an art gallery for homeless people. And they don't just use it as a space. They work on how does what we do support their mission? How do we work together to grow? And if you looked around the room at who was in that room, a number of the artists come to church with them. For a number of people, they have a robust meal on Saturday nights or Friday nights because a lot of people, that's a big source of calories for them for the week. So it's a real partnership. There's a real sense of like, why are we doing this together? And they didn't look inside the church for partners. Often if you look at a church's website and you look at outreach, I know this is true in the Diocese of Missouri where I am, there's a few churches that run like food pantries, and they've found other churches. So like a church in one part of the city will say, well, we do outreach with, even in St. John's where I went, we served at the homeless soup kitchen at Grace Georgetown. What are the community partners that aren't already part of our church that we could be cultivating? What are the relationships we could be building with people that aren't already in our midst? I'm going to show you one more video, another example of community partnership. This is from California. Something like that off. They have to be trained, they have to take ownership. But how much easier is it to say, hey, do you want to come down to the laundromat and have a bunch of people do their laundry? Or, hey, do you want to come down and have dinner in the art gallery with me on Saturday night? Over, hey, do you want to come to church on Sunday morning? One of the most important questions, I think, that I hear from young adult leaders who are really doing some amazing initiatives for Christ's mission, one of the best questions to ask is, what would I invite my friends to? What would you invite your friends to? What could we do together that would express who we are and we would feel comfortable inviting our friends to? I think Laundry Love is an example. And it's an example of how to partner. So I want to leave you with a few questions, and then we can ask questions of each other. But I think the question is pretty simple. How do we develop leaders who put people ahead of program and build community partnerships? So the questions I leave you with, who are the leaders your ministry is developing? How are you doing that intentionally? Who are your community partners? Who could you partner with? How do you prioritize people in the midst of program? And what new relationships are you building? I think that from what I see in the church, what I hear in the church, when we're focused on questions like that, really exciting stuff can happen. Thanks.
So before lunch, we wanted to just make sure there was an opportunity for you to interact with everybody that you've seen up here so far. So what questions do you have for either Mike or Aaron or Reagan thus far? Is there anything you would like to pose to Mike? Like the new program you're hoping his office might fund, or...
Both those videos, chaos was mentioned. And so what is chaos? What do we do about it? How do we embrace it? And how does that fit in with the three questions that are there?
What is, yeah, that's a good, is it better if I talk on this or can I talk? You know, chaos is that space that creation comes out of, right? Order out of chaos. I think sometimes, and we were joking about this last night a little bit when we were doing the hymn sing, which was so much fun, but sometimes Episcopalians are very, very, very into order. Not sometimes. We have books in order and rubrics are like what make us a people. We're very into order. And we've ordered a church. And we even talk about like the orders of ministry and that we've created a system. But what we're seeing is that our system was created in a time and place for a time and place, and we find ourselves in new times and places. And sometimes in order to serve in those places, we need to be comfortable letting the order become a little bit more disordered. And just, that's hard for Episcopalians. But it can also be really, really beautiful. Other thoughts on that? Great.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, this question is only half baked, but how, in what you're presenting, like how do we hold on to what makes us Episcopalian as well? Because I think like this church drives me crazy all the time, but like I can't leave because I don't know where else I'd go, you know, and it's like so part of me, and part of this ancient tradition is like part of who I am, and you know, I want to have my Savior's like blood and flesh in my mouth at least once a week, you know what I'm saying? So like, what in this, like, how do we hold to that tradition that makes us who we are, as well as, you know, watch and launch with people?
Yeah, I think that is a really important question and one that we have to hold on to, but I don't know that there's a concrete answer to it. And one of the things that, when you think about Anglicanism, right, it's a very strange tradition. It's sort of born in this crucible. If you take a look at the whole history of Anglicanism, England was this place where Celtic Christianity and Roman Christianity crashed into each other, and that took a little while to sort out. And it was a place where it had its own liturgical tradition. You know, when Augustine goes over, the Pope tells him to go and celebrate in the places where the people already have connections with nature. You know, he says don't throw away all the people's traditions. It's this very famous direction from the Pope to Augustine that really questions, you know, like, so don't throw away all of the people's traditions. Don't try to replace them entirely. Try to bring the Christianity into the context of these people. And then when the Reformation happens, you end up with this very strange balancing act where you're saying we're going to hold on to the tradition. We're going to take the rhythms of the Sarum Missal, the way that we've been praying for a really, really long time, and we're going to put them in the common language. And so Anglicanism has always been this wrestling between tradition and context. And I think that that's a really healthy place to be, because when you're in dialogue, there's room for growth. So yeah, I think all of these are experiments in tradition and context.
And Mike, I think that word experiment is good. I like how Steph Spellers talks about Anglicanism remixed.
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to, you know, take a piece of this and a piece of that and put it in this context, but still have that rooted in the beats and the rhythms of this tradition that we've inherited. I find that to be a useful image.
Yeah.
Seems to beg the question too. What is the core identity of
to be Episcopalian? What does it mean to be Episcopalian? What are the core pieces there? We might have a whole lot of assumptions about culture and habits, but what does it really mean to be Episcopalian? And that might free us from the rest of it.
Yep. And that goes back to what you were saying about, what were you saying? About, it was Mike. About how programs can't be thought of on the national level and then plugged in to certain environments. And it goes back to the core identity that churches and communities have to figure out what their core identity is and what will work for that, instead of hoping and praying that someone will come along peddling the right
Snake oil?
Yeah, the right secret trick to get young adults to come to church. Instead, they have to figure out what's important to them and do that well.
It's one of the things that you always want to turn on its head. It's so often the question that those of us who are in this room probably get asked is, where are the young adults? To which I say, I don't know, let's go find them. How do we get the young adults to church isn't really the question, I don't think. It's how do we get the church to young adults? And one of the things that we're seeing is that the initiatives that take the church out into the world, into the art gallery, into the laundromat, to the border, that though out into the bar, that is, I mean, Starbucks had something when they talked about third places, that to take your context, the tradition that you have, and move out into a place where you can serve or you can create community, that is go to where the young adults are. And develop community partnerships so that you can be, there's that old, I will bless you and you will be a blessing. But, think about what that laundromat, I mean, they're getting tons of business. The place is well taken care of. At Laundry Love, they also run kids programs. I don't know if you saw them setting up the games and stuff like that, but it's just a fun night. If you're the laundromat owner that usually has to be policing if people are moving their loads around and making you don't have to do that for a night. You can just sit there and enjoy. So how do you do that? It's one of the things that we worked on at St. John's too, is we really wanted to make sure at Theology on Tap that we were making the Brickskeller's life a little bit better on Monday nights. So it's making sure that there's a partnership in the space that you go to as well. Hannah.
Have you experienced with stories like this, cases of burnout, or how do you sustain that energy? I'm imagining that some of it is going to be that leaders are going to need to take a backstage at some point and bring in new leaders. But could you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think and a lot of you could probably talk about that. A lot of you could probably talk about either your own burnout or burnouts of leaders in your own context. I know I could. I think that attention to leadership development becomes really important there, because the work is always to be developing the next leader. And, a good leadership developer is developing a leader who's also developing a leader. And that's super critical in a town like Washington. For those of you who live in Washington, Bishop Mark Dyer, when I first came into my job, he and I had coffee. He was going to be our first Theology on Tap speaker. And we was talking about the work at St. John's right in downtown DC. And he said, the thing about a church like that and a city like Washington is people come here for 2-3 years. They come to work for somebody for a couple of years, for an agency, and they go back to Nashville or wherever they're from. And so he said that the role of a church in Washington, D.C. is that you're evangelizing the parade. They come in, they're with you, they march for a while, and they march on out. But how do you keep paying attention to and keep replacing the leaders, and how do you have more leaders than you need at any moment? Because that's where you have the creative space for new things to start. Ready to do a breakout?
One of the things that Mike said reminded me of in Jeremiah, when God's people are now subject to the Babylonian Empire, and they're like, okay, so what are we going to do? And God's direction to them is become a part of the fabric of the community. And you have to think that like the Israelites haven't just been so ticked off. Like, you gotta be kidding me, we thought you were gonna come in and kick butt and like, you know, set us free. And instead God says, no, I want you to plant gardens. I want you to become family with people that live here. And that is like a really central, animating story for God's people from that point on. That like our work, that idea of tradition and culture coming to our context, weaving together and finding new expressions and animating us is the way forward. It's always been there. This isn't anything new necessarily, although it feels like it once we kind of get to these different eras where we feel kind of entrenched and trying to break out of old habits. Okay, so this is what we'd like to do now.